On my honor, I will never betray my badge, my integrity, my character, or the public trust. I will always have the courage to hold myself and others accountable for our actions. I will always uphold the Constitution, my community, and the agency I serve. This is the law enforcement oath of honor. It's something that has since lost its meaning to many. In 1829, Sir Robert Peel established the Metropolitan Police Services in London. It was one of the first centralized professional police forces. Peel developed something called the Peelian Principles, as they are often called, insisting that the purpose of the police force is to prevent crime and maintain order. Police depend on the approval and trust of the public in order to effectively do their jobs. The ultimate goal of policing is to achieve voluntary compliance with the law in the community. Police must be unwavering in their duties and adherence to the law, maintaining impartiality and avoiding the temptation to be swayed by public opinion. They use force, and physical control is to be used as a last resort, only when other forms of persuasion have failed. Police officers must remember that they, too, are members of the public and that their purpose is to serve and protect the public. The true measure of the effectiveness of any police force is not the number of arrests or police actions taken, but the absence of criminal conduct and violations of the law. There was a lot of resistance to the initial idea because people were scared that the police force would be used as a paramilitary arm of the government. In order to help put out some of the public's fears, the police officers had uniforms that were different than the military's. They dressed in blue uniforms with top hats that made them seem more like a regular citizen, which is a stark contrast to how officers dress now. They look like military units using military-grade equipment. If they didn't have the word police on them, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. These original officers only had a wooden truncheon, a pair of handcuffs, and a wooden rattle, later replaced by a whistle to raise an alarm. Being a Peelian, or Bobby, came with strict rules. They worked 7 days a week with only 5 days unpaid holiday a year, for which they received the grand sum of €1 per week. Their lives were strictly controlled. They were not allowed to vote in elections and required permission to get married and even to share a meal with a civilian. To deter the public's suspicion of being spied upon, officers were required to wear their uniforms both on and off duty. Keeping the trust of the public was their ultimate aim. Now let's jump to the history of policing in America. It's even more interesting since it kind of started with the libertarian free-for-all concept that was found to be ineffective once the colonies began to grow. Policing was once a for-profit part-time job. This created a problem in which the rich people had security to protect their belongings, but everybody else was left to the wolves. Many towns had something called night watchmen. That was on a volunteer basis. It was mainly centered on trying to bust prostitution and gambling. You know, those damn sins from God. It wasn't that great of a system since there was no professional aspect to the job, and people just drank and slept while on duty. Some of these individuals were also put there as a form of punishment. This position didn't have any respectability about it, and people tried getting out of doing it. Here is where we come into some interesting interpretations of the past. In the South, policing developed from something entirely different than the North. It was developed to protect the institution of slavery. Now, I can hear all the Jordan Peterson fans clicking pause and now crying about postmodernism or some shit, but this was taken from multiple sources, and they have all described the same thing. Policing in the South began with the slave patrols in 1704. These patrols served 3 primary functions. 1. To chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves. 2. To provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And 3. To maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside of the law if they violated any plantation rules. After the Civil War, these organizations evolved into a means to control freed slaves and enforce Jim Crow laws. Urbanization was happening at such an alarming rate that the old system of constables and watchmen could no longer effectively police or maintain order. Many individuals were complaining about social and public disorder. Most of these complaints were just anecdotal, and there is very little evidence to suggest an increase in crime. During this time period, those in power defined what disorder was, and at this moment, it was the mercantile interests who funded the police force through taxes and political interests. These merchants, who were more inclined to enact social control than actual crime prevention. It turns out that private and for-profit policing was incredibly inefficient and too crime-specific in order to obtain these goals. They wanted to ensure a stable and orderly workforce, a stable and orderly environment for the conduct of business, and the maintenance of what they referred to as the collective good. On top of that, they realized they could save money by socializing the cost of policing and framing it under the collective good narrative, so that the cost of policing was then transferred to the state. What did these merchants need social control for? Well, they would benefit immensely from having a stable and disciplined workforce for the developing system of factory production, and ensuring a safe and tranquil community for the conduct of commerce. With inequality rising rapidly and the exploitation of workers, this was before workers' rights, many merchants were in fear of riots, which predated union strikes against employers. The modern police force not only provided an organized, centralized body of men legally authorized to use force to maintain order, it also provided the illusion that this order was being maintained under the rule of law, not at the whim of those with economic power. They redefined social control as crime control and promoted the idea of dangerous classes of people in society. The suggestion was that public drunkenness, crime, hooliganism, political protests, and worker riots were the products of a biologically inferior, morally intemperate, unskilled, and uneducated underclass. The consumption of alcohol was widely seen as a major cause of crime and public disorder. This class of people was easily definable since it was made up of poor foreign immigrants and free blacks. Does this ring a bell?
Nearly 180,000 illegal immigrants with criminal records ordered deported from our country are tonight roaming free to threaten peaceful citizens. The number of new illegal immigrant families who have crossed the border so far this year already exceeds the entire total from 2015. They are being released by the tens of thousands into our communities with no regard for the impact on public safety or resources.
The political machine had a lot of power at this time, and with that power, there was loads of corruption. One Time article states, fear of labor union organizers and large waves of Catholic, Irish, Italian, German, and Eastern European immigrants who looked and acted differently from the people who had dominated cities before, drove the call for the preservation of law and order, or at least the version of it promoted by dominant interests. Heads of the police force were picked by local political wardens. This influenced the type of justice served by being able to buy out policemen to turn a blind eye to illegal activities and influence those that ran the force. By the late 19th century, municipal police forces were primarily used to break strikes. Many of the riots, which so concerned local economic elites, were actually strikes called against specific companies. The use of public employees to serve private economic interests and to use legally ordained force against organizing workers was both cost-effective for manufacturing concerns and politically useful in that it confused the issue of workers' rights with the issue of crime. Sound familiar? This is a common talking point for the people of the right. Instead of having a conversation about the root cause of the incident, they disregard it by framing it as rioting that carries a criminal feeling to it instead of civil unrest. Police strike breaking came in two distinct forms. One was through physical violence, while the second was more subtle. This was done through the mass arresting of workers under public order crimes. These are described as crimes which involve acts that interfere with the operations of society and the ability of people to function efficiently. It basically hones in on crimes like prostitution, recreational drug use, and general moral rules. These mass arrests kept workers from being able to organize against their employers. They also used ambiguous vagrancy laws like the Tramp Act to arrest union workers and the unemployed. At first, police officers did not want to wear uniforms because they were scared that they would be subject to violence. Also, police only began carrying firearms because many of them had already decided to carry them, even though it was not policy. Eventually, the police departments adopted this policy since the majority of officers were armed by their own means. The use of force was also hotly contentious since police primarily focused on public order laws. The public was generally against the use of force. However, a heavily armed paramilitary patrolling the streets served the interest of the business and wealth class. They helped intervene between the respectable classes and the dangerous class of the poor, propertyless individuals and foreigners. President Hoover appointed the Wickersham Commission in 1929 to examine what was perceived as a rising crime rate and police ineffectiveness in dealing with crime. It focused primarily on surveying the U.S. justice system under Prohibition. The commission found that there was corruption in police ranks, local politics, and problems in every community that attempted to enforce prohibition laws. The report also concluded that there was a general failure to detect and arrest criminals guilty of the many murders, spectacular bank, payroll, and other holdups, and sensational robberies with guns. Basically, police departments were being selective in how they enforced the law and to whom. By the 1950s, police professionalism began to take hold. The idea that the police department should be centralized with a military-style discipline and a chain of command began to spread throughout the country. However, it did not really help the police departments with their image. The new policies antagonized tension between the police and the communities they served and created rancor and dissension within the department themselves. They also created police departments that were vast bureaucracies, inward-looking, isolated from the public, and defensive in the face of any criticism. See, professionalism was more geared towards efficiency and not necessarily best forms of practice. The departments became highly authoritarian, and this eventually led to the unionization of police officers to get them to be treated like regular civilian employees. According to a paper written by Catherine Fish from Berkeley, an important goal of the professionalism era was to control rank-and-file officers, leading to extensive and strict rules to govern their conduct, increase surveillance and oversight of officers, and reduce rank-and-file officer discretion. The control of the rank-and-file did not end with their work-related duties. Police management also attempted to control the personal lives of officers in order to reduce the opportunities for corruption. Officers were prohibited from living in the areas they policed, from incurring debts, or from being involved in businesses in their areas, as well as required to declare the business interests of their families. Some departments went even further to depersonalize policing by frequently reassigning patrol officers to new neighborhoods far removed from the neighborhoods where the officers lived. This and a host of other controls helped spur the creation of police unions. Dr. Gary Potter concludes his paper with, "From the beginning, American policing has been intimately tied not to the problem of crime, but to the exigencies and demands of the American political economy. From the anti-immigrant bashing of early police forces to the strike-breaking of the later 1800s to the massive corruption of the early 20th century through professionalism, tailorization, and now attempts at amelioration through community policing. The role of the police in the United States has been defined by economics and politics, not crime or crime control. As we look to the 21st century, it now appears likely that a new emphasis on science and technology, particularly related to citizen surveillance, A new wave of militarization reflected the spread of SWAT teams and other paramilitary squads, and a new emphasis on community pacification through community policing are all destined to replay the failures of history as the police of the future. Notice the stark differences between how America's police department started and how they started in London. They have almost the exact opposite starting points. One was more focused on creating an image that didn't scare the public and to seek out trust, while the other was built around corruption and political influences disguised as law and order. This law and order concept has been used for quite some time to justify actions against certain groups of peoples and classes. It's interesting how soon history is forgotten, even though it wasn't that long ago. Policing in America didn't start with the intention of curtailing crime, but to control and shape the moral norms of society. The original night watchmen only cared about prostitution and gambling. They were sort of like the moral police. Then it evolved into the extension of business power that socialized its costs of security for their goods. The history of policing has very little to do with the image of police officers we have today, the protectors of the public. Even today, they are still an extension of political power. With money being able to influence so much of the political realm, the actual public has very little say in implementation and creation of laws. If companies, lobbyists, or the wealthy can effectively buy votes, then who are the laws the police really protecting? So let's shift our focus to the issue of police brutality. I wanted to explain the history of policing first to hopefully break up our commonly shared image of police being the servants of the public. They have not always practiced this new concept of community policing. Also, a lot of things get lost when we talk about police brutality. One side sees them as the defender of the good. I see Matthew 5:9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God," posted on yard signs with the American flag and a blue line all over. They equate these individuals with the divine right theory. Those in power were put there by God, so listen to them and in return follow God's will. On the other side, they see police officers as this growing paramilitary that protects the property of the elite or protects the power of specific social classes. Power and structure. I want to break down the concepts surrounding my ideas on police brutality. I'll begin with the first one, which I believe to be the one with the biggest influence. It's the idea of obedience to authority. Authority is inherently opposed to the concept of personal freedom. It is defined as the power or right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience, while obedience is defined as compliance with any order, request, or law, or submission to another's authority. So why would anyone want to submit to one's authority and show obedience? In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram did a famous research study called the Obedience Study. In this study, they concluded that obedience is highest when commands were given by an authority figure rather than another volunteer. The experiments were done at a prestigious institution. The authority figure was present in the room with the subject. The learner was in another room, and the subject did not see other subjects disobeying commands. In this study, people were asked to participate to help understand the effects of punishment on learning. He assigned each of the subjects to the role of teacher. Each subject was told to take this task to help another subject like himself learn a list of word pairs. Each time the learner made a mistake, the teacher was to give the learner an electric shock by flipping a switch. The teacher was told to increase the shock level each time the learner made a mistake, until a dangerous shock level was reached. They figured out that people were willing to take obedience based on a limited number of factors. People justify their behavior by assigning responsibility to the authority rather than themselves. People define the behavior that's expected of them as routine. People don't want to be rude or offend the authority. People obey easy commands first and then feel compelled to obey more and more difficult commands. This process is called entrapment, and it illustrates the foot in the door phenomenon. Many of these defenses were in the trials of Nuremberg. The soldiers said that they were just following orders. This, of course, was not a substantial defense, and many of the Nazis were found guilty for their crimes. Now, when we add the idea of a group and conformity, things begin to get more complex. Groups usually have these certain features associated with them: norms that determine appropriate behavior, roles that are assigned to people that determine what behaviors and responsibilities people should take on, a communication structure that determines who talks to whom within the group, and a power structure that determines how much authority and influence group members have. There are two types of group conformity. Normative conformity is yielding to group pressure because a person wants to fit in with the group. Conforming because the person is scared of being rejected by the group. This type of conformity usually involves compliance, where a person publicly accepts the views of a group but privately rejects them. Informational conformity. This usually occurs when a person lacks knowledge and looks to the group for guidance, or when a person is in an ambiguous, unclear situation and socially compares their behavior with the group. This type of conformity usually involves internalization, where a person accepts the views of the groups and adopts them as an individual. Obedience can stem from group conformity that is defined through the norms of that group. Policing has a power structure that was originally very similar to the power structure of the home. Just like you would see the parent-child dynamic, the police-civilian dynamic mirrored this structure. Children have historically been taught to respect their parents as figures of authority and according to their normative roles. This same type of respect was then generally transferred to other power structure because of the similarity of patterns. In the past, Christianity had a major influence in the family unit. Authority and obedience to the parents was taught as something that pleased God Himself. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in discipline and instruction of the Lord. Ephesians 6:1-4. In this day and age, Christianity does not have as much hold on the structure of the family unit. With those who identify with religion declining, family units are becoming more diverse in their parenting. We are teaching children to question everything and to inquire about their surroundings using critical thinking. Authority itself is not immune to this questioning. I believe that it is only natural for human beings to question and rebel against authority until they establish their own reasoning as to why they should accept this power structure. This may have something to do with the respect for law enforcement in general and why tensions between the civilians and officers have been so high. In a chapter called A Relational Model of Authority in Groups by Tom R. Tyler and E. Allen Lynn from the Advances in Experimental Social Psychology journal, they point out that when everyday groups or organizations, legal, political, managerial, or familiar, are faced with problems, a common response is to create rules and empower authorities. This propensity towards structure and authority has been demonstrated in laboratory experiments on rule creation and social dilemmas, as well in the field of studies of how people deal with real-world conflicts and problems of scarcity. In other words, human beings naturally create authority structures because they are motivated to preserve their mutually beneficial relationship and have some power with which to bargain. These 2 points are key to cooperation. Both parties must have something to give and must have something just as equal to gain. So when a civilian gives into authority and loses their life, still, what would cause others to cooperate? The authors state that a real-world example of the empowerment of authorities in response to perceived threat is seen in polls on fear of crime. Polls show that when the public feels that crime is a serious problem, people are especially likely to support increasing the discretionary authority of police and courts. People are likely to support allowing the police to stop people on the street for identification, to hold people in jail without charges, and to conduct wiretaps. At such times, public endorsement of severe punishments such as the death penalty is also greater. This is interesting because when you look at the rhetoric surrounding the Trump administration, even though crime is at an all-time low and so is immigration, you would think that this wasn't you wouldn't think that listening to their narratives. But you can kind of see the same support of authority practices today. I hear many people on the right support stop and frisk policies to help curtail illegal immigration. Show your ID laws have also become pretty popular again as well. The article further suggests that authority structures must function effectively and actually enhance group functioning. Research suggests that people under authority do not immediately accept or comply with their decisions. The author split obedience into two separate powers, reward power and coercive power, and distinguished them from legitimate power. Legitimate power refers to the actual person taking it upon themselves to obey and voluntarily follow instructions. They distinguish between compliance, obedience that occurs in response to the provision of material outcomes, identification, obedience that occurs because the authority is held in high esteem, and eternalization, obedience that occurs because the values of the authority are accepted. Police officers deal with shitty situations all damn day. They deal with the worst of society on a daily basis, and eventually they begin to compartmentalize the situations around them. They are human beings too, and can only deal with so many negative events before it begins to change who they are. They expect a certain level of respect that comes with their inherent wearing of the uniform. They are authority figures and expect that civilians would do as asked or told to by them. Beyond being authority figures, they also have the means to enact violence against those who do not follow instructions. This is also meant to be another deterrent from dissent, but when both of these influences fail to command respect and obedience, many officers act out on their agitation. Like a parent trying to get their child to do something, it agitates the parent even more when they know the child understands that the parent is an authority figure and can enact violence against them, and the child still refuses to comply. This is the dynamic inherent in the power structures we have produced. When someone refuses to obey, it creates tension within these structures, and those at the top act out to reinforce their status within it. But at the same time, we teach people to be individual and free. We create this sort of cognitive dissonance between obedience and individualism. We want them to conform to the group norms, but at the same time be individuals with their own ideas. These ideologies clash when it comes to law and order within a society. We want people to be innovative and think outside the box to drive innovation, yet we expect them not to challenge authority. We want sheep in one area with unquestionable obedience, but leaders in another where they take the path least traveled. Yes, there is a difference between someone just being straight up disrespectful with the intent to provoke police officers. I can agree to that. And just like the parent-child dynamic, children challenge their parents to understand the limits of their freedom. This doesn't mean they shouldn't suffer the consequences. It just means they don't need to be violently beaten or killed for doing so. Police officers hold an incredible amount of power in society that was given to them through the trust of the people. In recent years, that trust has been severely strained, and citizens are starting to question the amount of authority we have granted them. See, police officers sit in a hierarchy of power in which they arrest offenders so that they can be tried in a court. Police officers are enforcers of the law, but are not judge and jury. They should remain impartial when it comes to perpetrators, because in America, people are innocent until proven guilty. Any action of a police officer that serves as a form of punishment should be highly scrutinized. Any violation of procedural due process is a violation of the Constitution. Procedural due process is defined as the guarantee of a fair legal process when the government tries to interfere with a person's protected interests in life, liberty, or property, and substantive due process is the guarantee that the fundamental rights of citizens will not be encroached on by the government. Reactions to authority. When it comes down to it, you have an authority trying to take the freedom away from an individual. When an officer goes to arrest a person, some of them fight back like an animal being backed into a corner. They know they're about to have their freedoms restricted, and when you believe that you did nothing wrong, you fight to keep that freedom no matter what. This is a normal human behavior called reactance theory in psychology. This theory assumes that there are free behaviors individuals perceive and can take part of at any moment. This is based upon the fact that the individual has the physical and psychological ability to perform that behavior. Behavior is explained as what one does, how one does it, or when one does something. There are several rules associated with free behaviors and reactance. 1. When certain free behaviors are threatened or removed, the more important a free behavior is to a certain individual, the greater the magnitude of reactance. A. The level of reactance has a direct relationship to the importance of the eliminated or threatened behavioral freedom in relationship to the importance of other freedoms at the time. 2. With a given set of free behaviors, the greater the proportion threatened or eliminated, the greater will be the total level of reactance. 3. When an important free behavior has been threatened with elimination, the greater will be the threat, and the greater will be the level of reactance. A. When there is a loss of a single free behavior, there may be implication a related threat of removal of other free behaviors is now or in the future. B. A free behavior may be threatened or eliminated by virtue of elimination or threat of elimination of another free behavior. Therefore, a free behavior may be threatened by the relation of the elimination of or threat to another person's free behavior. Based upon this theory, when an officer threatens one with arrest, their personal freedoms are being threatened. A reactance is going to happen. Now, I'm not using this as an excuse for bad behavior. I'm merely pointing out that there is a theory to explain why people get so upset when their freedoms are threatened, especially if they feel that they have done no wrong and choose to resist the police authority. The authority of the police is second to the freedom of the individual. Some people will accept their consequences or the authority of the police without question. Good for them. However, when you feel you're being wrongfully arrested or detained, you feel almost powerless in your situation. This feeling of powerlessness can cause people to do incredibly irrational things. It can either empower you to resist the status quo or it can make you rationalize that injustice is what it is. I bring this up because knowing this should cause officers to reevaluate how they respond in these situations accordingly. Should the problem be escalated to the maximum amount of violence legally? No, why would anyone want to do that? Police officers should not be quick to show their authority through force. It undoubtedly paints them in a negative light and influences all future interactions with them. When a citizen sees that law enforcement can freely take their life without much consequence, then the citizen will have either one of two mindsets. The first is that they will just completely submit and allow the officers to do whatever they wish. The second is to be cautious, knowing that even if you follow all the directions given to you, you could still be harmed or killed. The benefit of the doubt usually goes towards the police officer. They can just say they felt threatened, and that will usually get them off the hook. This reminds me of a South Park episode where Ned takes the kids hunting.
Boys, looky there. There's a Rocky Mountain black bear. One of the few remaining of its kind. Isn't it beautiful? By God, it's coming right for us! You see, boys, the Democrats have passed a lot of laws trying to stop us from hunting.
Democrats piss me off.
They say we can't shoot certain animals anymore unless they're posing an immediate threat. Therefore, before we shoot something, we have to say, it's coming right for us.
Ned uses a legal defense of claiming that it was coming right for us to skirt around the laws. In many cases, self-defense can get you out of legal trouble when it comes to harming someone. Similar to stand your ground laws that can be misused in order to justify killing someone. Are there legitimate uses of these laws? Sure, but the use of force should always be the last resort, especially when it comes to police officers. I hear the common argument that police officers have a dangerous job of protecting us from criminals, and that their lives matter just as much. I agree. However, it's not like these police officers signed up for something they had no idea about. They knew that every day they put on their uniform, their life could end. This is a voluntary choice. When I was in the military, I knew what I had signed up for when I joined. I knew I was going straight to Iraq and that my life would be put in danger. Yet, I still treated everyone with respect, even the foreign nationals whom I didn't know if I could trust that I came into contact with every day. Their perception of me, the army, and my country were incredibly important in gaining their trust. I knew that at any time I could be killed. This didn't cause me to act irrationally, though. Sure, I became complacent after the 50th rocket attack alarm sound and no longer ran to the bunker, but that's about it. I was assigned to providing medical care for detainees. All the detainees were being held by the government of Iraq and had not officially been charged with a crime. Also, working in a level 3 combat support hospital, I had to take care of detainees who had just injured fellow American soldiers. As a medic, I had to treat all these individuals as if they were human beings in need of medical care. Their circumstances of why they were in my care had nothing to do with their level of care or how I treated them. On top of that, we were trying to gain the trust of the Iraqi people through our Hearts and Minds campaign. Everything I did was imperative to that mission. Why? If I treated an enemy combatant with the same dignity and respect as I would any other human being, then it could get these individuals to rethink how they viewed Americans. This could lead some of these individuals cutting ties with their extremist groups and could change the mind of some of that group members to give up the fight. Their personal stories of how the Americans interacted with them could be used as a deconversion strategy that would be more effective than hearing it from the American military. Keeping up our trust and good standing with the people of Iraq was a top mission priority. We needed their trust to help weed out terrorist groups and get critical information of their movements. By this time, we were basically a police force to help Iraq until they could train their own standing army. If the military understood that gaining the trust of people you are trying to protect was mission critical, then why has it become such a problem with our own law enforcement? My own theory is that the fact that police officers are rarely held accountable for their actions and have an incredible amount of respect given to them based upon their job title and not actual merit of each individual officer. Police crimes are not very well documented nor reported, and when they are rarely ever convicted. I implore you to go to the website in the link below called policecrime.bgsu.edu and look around all the data that they have collected. So, why is it hard to take an objective look at policing in America? I believe there are two major factors: those who unapologetically support them and the brotherhood. This is the first form of protection they receive from our culture. I'm not saying that it isn't warranted. Police officers do some noble shit. I mean, they put on their uniform every day knowing that they may be killed. While it's not a direct correlation to the military, it does have the same connotation. One protects our country and the other one protects our communities. I believe the same affirmation that the military has from individuals is easily transferred to that of law enforcement. You have people who want order and believe in the rule of law. When I say believe in the rule of law, I don't mean the opposite of anarchist. I mean they feel even unjust laws need to be followed and can be debated in the judicial system later. They come from this idea of strict adherence to authority. To question it is to be out of line. They have framed disobedience to be a sign of disrespect instead of it being about justice and exercising an individual right to question authority. These people usually are okay with authoritarian principles and have strong religious beliefs. Authority and religion have a pretty strong bond. It has to, in order for the words of Jesus and the commandments of God to have any teeth to them. The Bible teaches those that have authority derived it from God, and that authority needs to be adhered to. Hebrews 13:17. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. Romans 13:1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. 1 Peter 2:13. Be subject, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil, and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should be put to silence the ignorant of foolish people. I find this verse to be the most telling of them all. 1 Peter 2:18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your souls. See, injustice is merely suffering, which is what Jesus did. Through suffering and obedience, you will be reborn and live on in righteousness. This is why the religious right protect the image of police officers no matter what. They see them as people who are just doing God's work. On the other side of the coin is something I know all too well. The brotherhood. I guess you could call this tribalism. It is a social framework in which communities are bound socially, beyond other forms of dominance and power. Wikipedia describes tribalism as the possession of a strong cultural or ethnic identity that separates one member of a group from the members of another group. Based on strong relations of proximity and kinship, members of the tribe tend to possess a strong feeling of identity. Objectively, for a customary tribal society to form, there needs to be ongoing customary organization, inquiry, and exchange. However, intense feelings of common identity can lead people to feel tribally connected. This term can also be applied to the culture aspect I talked about before this. The individuals who unapologetically support police officers have this intense feeling of identity with others that do the same. This is why they have yard signs and stickers with thin blue lines to show their allegiance to this particular tribe. What's funny is these same people attack the left for virtue signaling when their outward support for this tribe is based upon virtue signaling. They are trying to show that they are in the moral right by appealing to others as law-abiding citizens. Being law-abiding, or a rule follower, is the virtue point that they are trying to convey. But back to the brotherhood. I believe that the brotherhood is much stronger than many of the forms of tribalism today. The brotherhood is forged through intense life or death situations between its members. Believe me, I'm a veteran. The veteran community is a huge brotherhood, and it developed while we were on active duty. Police officers develop this brotherhood through similar ways that the military does. Patrolling certain areas may have a lot of the same feeling as patrolling the streets of Baghdad. The constant threat and fear of being attacked drives you closer to the individual next to you. You begin to rely on each other with total and complete trust. You build this type of relationship in which you know they will see your life just as valuable as their own. Because of that, you don't have to worry about the 360 degrees of space your body encompasses. That individual with you reduces that area substantially so that you can focus more on other areas. It is a sense of family forged through not only dangerous situations, but also the mundane parts of life. Just as soldiers sit in foxholes for days with nothing to do, police officers have that same time within their squad cars. Relationships are built through the hundreds of hours of time spent with each other. They become a part of your family because you see them day in and day out. You see them at their absolute worst and their absolute best. They become a part of your world in this intimate way that no other relationship really can. When two individuals share a life or death experience, a bond is built that is incredibly hard to describe or even understand. What is more complex is that these two individuals may not even get along on any other social aspect. They may even despise the ideas that the other person holds, but those ideas don't seem to matter when they are in these dire situations. See, everything goes out the window when the danger shows up. Everyone becomes a team and relies on each other for their safety. They know that their survival depends not only on their actions, but that of the person to their left and right. Survival becomes the driving factor, and this brings people together. Just like national tragedies can bring a country together, life or death situations can bring people of all backgrounds together into a singular force. So, why is this a form of protection? The Brotherhood doesn't rat out their fellow members. The bond that is formed is greater than any sense of justice from outside sources. When a member of the Brotherhood is being attacked, even if it's not in a life or death situation, the Brotherhood protects that individual no matter what. Crimes committed by the members of the Brotherhood are either swept under the rug or dealt with internally. A code of silence is adopted. The survival of the Brotherhood becomes more important than anything to its members. This explains why so many lie about events that happen when they come under scrutiny, or will try and collude all their stories when criminal consequences hang in the balance. The Brotherhood becomes more important than the mission of the organization itself. It becomes an us versus them mentality instead of that of public servitude. The future. So knowing what we know now, where do we go from here? We have to sit down and ask a serious question. How much do we value individual human life? From that, we build upon that answer to get to a system that is more just. Justice is the central component in this situation. People don't want to lose their freedom to something they don't understand or feel that they have been unjustifiably accused of. This is where the court systems come into play. Our current system of justice is also not entirely just either, but that is where these arguments should happen. This could be a factor in why people resist to even go to jail. They know justice will not be on their side even when it should be. So, do we value individual human life? It seems we do from a societal standpoint. Everybody has an individual right to life according to our values. The issue of abortion is focused entirely on this premise. I find it ironic that those same people who are against abortion support the needless killing of people for trivial things by police officers, but whatever. So, if we value individual human life, when is it okay for that life to be valueless? When one refuses to listen to a police officer? When one is just running from being thrown into jail? When one has a broken taillight? When one has a toy gun playing in the park? We need to emphasize that life is valuable no matter what, and not just the people who voluntarily choose to enforce laws. Yes, police officer lives matter just as much. However, they signed up for this. They know that every day they put on that uniform, they will be put in harm's way. This is a choice for them. They know the dangers of their profession, and they should be able to handle the situations they may find themselves in. This is why we give them so much power. We trust that they will make the best decisions to ensure the safety of the community. However, they are not executioner. They are not the ones to deal out punishments. This is the job for the judicial system. Police officers' main goal is to make sure that the individual has the ability to make it to that point. They are the enforcers of the law, not the punishers. I think we've lost sight of this fundamental right that everyone is due their day in a court of law. There are some incredibly rare circumstances in which this doesn't apply, but those should be made on a case-by-case basis. The officer should have to defend their actions in a court of law and be judged by the public. Why? Because the public is the only reason why they have the power to be a police officer in the first place. Police officers need to be better trained in conflict resolution and how to end conflicts in non-lethal ways. If we focused on the point that justice is served through the judicial system, police officers would change the way they react in certain situations if we held their feet to the fire. See, as soon as someone perceives one has broken the law, the value of their life seems to diminish. This diminishment results in a different type of treatment because of that perceived value. The police officer or the law-abiding citizen automatically feel their life now has more value, and that even if perceived lawbreaker dies, it would be a positive for society. Killing another human being should always be seen as a negative. What do I mean by that? That even when an officer justifiably kills someone, we should hold the negative connotation until the facts are sorted out and it is found justifiable. It shouldn't be automatically justifiable based upon the premise that the officer feared for his life or anything else. It should be proven that the loss of life was necessary. This will keep the value we place on individual life equitable and will be the primary focus when police officers react. In saying this, I realize that I place the criminal and the officer's life on the same plane, and that if an officer reacts because they believe their life is in danger, then it would apply just as equally. This is where I will say something pretty unpopular. In the role of the servant's life is less valuable than that of the master. In the case of law enforcement, they are public servants, yet they hold an incredible amount of power over the public. To balance this out, we must remind officers that the public is more valuable. The public is the only reason for their existence. So when one kills a member of the public, they lose a portion of their power by depleting the entity that they derive their power and reason for existing from. I want to compare this outlook to that of the complexity surrounding artificial intelligence. Obviously, AI will surpass the ability of humans. It will become far stronger, faster, and superior. Is it something we need to be worried of? To some, yes, but I believe it's really on how we handle the power we give it. We must clearly define its limits and establish clear and concise rules for it to follow. It has to be a servant in order to balance its obvious power over human beings. We give it power as long as it serves our interest, that interest being the survivability of the human race. We fundamentally cannot treat AI as equal because human beings will never be equal. It's this hierarchy of power. It's this hierarchy or power structure that balances out the inherent differences between the subjects. Now use the same argument for police officers. We give police officers an incredible amount of power and the general benefit of the doubt. In return, they enforce our laws and protect our communities. They serve the public in return for the obvious power that they have over us. Police officers are inherently unequal to normal citizens because of that power. They can take your life without question. Sure, they may be punished later for it, but they have the ultimate authority in any given situation. Imagine if we gave AI that same power. Would you trust a robot making the same decision? Probably not. See, we have created this imbalance of power with our protection and the Brotherhood's protection of the institutions surrounding law enforcement. This is the injustice we are trying to point towards when it gets too out of hand, before it becomes an us versus them narrative. We wouldn't want AI to overpower us, so why do we not hold police officers to the same standard? In many cases, police officers should be given the benefit of the doubt. It is an incredibly stressful job that requires some of the most complex decision making I can think of. Making the decision of what is a threat to your individual personal safety can lead to some bias in many circumstances and cause people to act irrational. The fear of death is an incredible motivator and can influence one to react out of fear and emotion. However, the term sacrifice is something that gets lost here. Police officers do have the right to return home at the end of their shift. This right does not supersede their original purpose of being a public servant, though. They knowingly put on that uniform and receive training, a salary, and benefits knowing that their life will be in danger. This is a part of that sacrifice that legitimizes the power police officers wield. If a police officer isn't willing to lose their life in order to protect the citizen, then they have no reason to be a police officer. I know this may sound harsh and anti-police, but it's not. This is the truth when it comes to defining policing in our day of age. We need to set aside our biases towards the profession and really take a look at why we have police officers. We need to make sure we clearly define our expectations of the profession and hold officers accountable to them. If we don't, then the trust between the profession of policing and the citizen is going to diminish. I don't want this. I want kids to fantasize about growing up to become police officers. I want them to see it as a noble and respectable profession to aspire to become. I want to be able to approach an officer on the street and feel completely confident that they are there to assist me when I am in need. I want people to be able to have interactions with the police and not fear being killed because of a simple misunderstanding or a power trip. I just want justice in all aspects of our system. We do not have that now. A black football player cannot even peacefully demonstrate his discontent with the system without it being misconstrued to something it's not about. His message gets lost in a sea of virtue signaling that the right constantly tells us is a terrible action. The right turns it into an us versus them rhetoric in order to derail the conversation. They cite respect for the flag, yet consistently disrespect the flag according to the code. Anyone who flies the American flag on the back of their truck is disrespecting it in my mind. They cite that not standing disrespects the troops, yet they repeatedly fail to actually pass any policy that could help veterans. All they do is offer lip service in an attempt to virtue signal to others. The right has turned it into a patriotic issue, even though protesting and standing up for injustice are what define this country in the first place. The right has turned it into they are employees of a company and you cannot do that on an employer's time. Even though they are crying over Alex Jones being banned for violating terms of service agreements of a private company, and are calling for the nationalization of social media sites to combat their perverse idea of perceived social injustice. People get upset when you make it about race and color, so I have framed this issue as police brutality in general. It affects people of all color and race. The left wants to move this conversation, we have to frame it as police brutality. We cannot keep hammering this message about blacks being disproportionately killed by officers when the other side already sees people of color as perpetrating criminality within their communities. They see it as a result of their culture, and because of that, they don't care. We will continue to lose this fight unless we figure out how to take race out of the equation and make it about the topic in general. By no means am I trying to say that injustices don't exist, but they are only injustices in our frame of mind and not those in the opposition's. Solutions. I think one of the biggest solutions start with law enforcement. 3 critical areas I feel that would decrease police brutality are training, funding, and accountability. First is training, of course. Police officers need to go through these motions over and over so that they can be prepared to handle a variety of circumstances. The police academy shouldn't be the end-all of police training. One of the biggest things the military harped on is repetition. You repeat the task over and over until it becomes muscle memory. That way, when you face the real situation, your body should react with very little emotional input. Fear has to be minimalized as much as possible in order to reduce mistakes and emotional reactions. Officers need to continually train on conflict resolution and de-escalation tactics. We don't need situations to always end in the death of the suspect. I have seen countless videos of police officers where I feel the officer was justified in shooting, and they never did, yet the situation was resolved with no injury to either party. A part of this training should be a massive community outreach that officers must participate in. The community and police officers need to interact outside of the normal confines one would encounter them in. This builds trust and relationships with the community and the officers across the board. People need to see each other as people and not just bodies in uniforms with the authority to detain. People in a community should be welcoming to the police and not fear them entering their spaces. These community outreach programs would involve trying to make the community a better place that would ultimately decrease crime in the area. Police officers should want to be around the communities that they are patrolling. They need to have an invested interest in that community's future. It shouldn't just be another 9 to 5 feeling. Funding is always a problem and is actually quite comical when you think about it. The right generally wants less taxation and smaller government. This would trickle over to the effectiveness of the police because of smaller budgets and less tax revenues. But the right is also the party of law and order. Their rhetoric is at odds with their political ideology. For the most part, when I speak about funding, it isn't necessarily for military grade or new equipment, but more money to increase salaries, benefits, and staff. By staff, I don't mean a cop on every corner. That would increase tensions and make it feel like we're always being watched. This would have the opposite effect of building trust. What I mean is, going back to my first point, training. We need to make sure we adequately train our officers without losing their ability to respond to emergencies. This is why I suggest we have more than enough officers so that some are being trained on things once a week without the need to be pulled on duty except for extreme circumstances. We could have officers getting training on monthly rotations for a week at a time. This would include tactical, community, and physical training. That way the officers are not burnt out and can de-stress. This training is going to cost money, so that is how it ties back to funding. Our police stations should be adequately funded to provide this type of training. This training can be centralized facilities that multiple departments can share in order to reduce cost. But the money has to be there in order to ensure that our law enforcement is continually being trained and kept up to date on how to react to emergencies. That is why we have less incidences of escalation and less money being paid out to victims. Lastly is accountability. This is what can almost sum up the entirety of the issue surrounding police brutality. If we as a society began to take the cops' actions seriously and hold them accountable for their actions, then I believe we wouldn't have this problem on the scale that we see now. Cops cannot feel like they are above the law just because they enforce it. They need to be held to the same standards as everyone else, and if they're not, then bad apples become the norm, as those who unapologetically defend police will ultimately lead to the degradation of the profession. We cannot objectively sit there and call out behavior that we feel is incompatible with justifying the power given to officers. Then we have a problem. No one or no thing is above criticism, period. We also need to find a way to break the influence of the brotherhood that keeps officers silent, or to protect the actions of others in their profession. We all know mistakes happen, but we can deal with them as such. If we honestly make a mistake, then we should treat the police officers just the same as a civilian, and when they commit honest mistakes. The problem is that police officers can plant and destroy evidence, collude their stories, and flat out disregard crimes. This is the type of behavior that needs to be rooted out and abolished. This creates corruption, and we shouldn't stand for it nor allow it to fester. Allowing it to continue derails our concept of justice. One solution is more citizen review boards to remove the bias of police officers. Sure, not all citizens know or understand how police officers are trained and how they should react, but ultimately, police officers exist to serve the citizen. So should the citizen's perception not account for anything? Citizens should be the ones who decide how they feel they should be treated, since the power that police officers are given is through their express consent. Just like government uses independent review processes, so should law enforcement. It shouldn't matter if the citizens disagree with how the police officer reacted, because their voice should have a large part in how policing evolves. Now, do I think criminal charges should always be brought with every incident? No, but I do feel that they should face losing their authority and power. They should have to defend their actions to a review from citizens. Police officers should fear losing their job if their actions resulted in the death of an individual. They should fear losing their job if they react out of unjustified anger and physically abuse an individual to reinstate their power or authority. We need to punish certain behaviors in order to deter them from being present in our law enforcement. Could that punishment be retraining and counseling? Certainly, depending on the incident and its severity. I get that cities spend an incredible amount of money training police officers, and firing one would result in more expenses down the road. However, how much money would the city save from lawsuits? How much money would the city save in the time spent on investigating problematic police officers? Would the increased trust in the police force not lead to more money being budgeted or an increase in taxes if requested? If you want to point out a cost-benefit analysis, tell me the individual price of a life. And I'm not referring to the police officers because I've addressed that earlier. Conclusion. We need to address the problem that we have with our law enforcement structures. We need to have a serious and honest discussion about their role in our society and how they should conduct that role. Citizens need to have more input in these areas and their implementations. Lives are at stake here. It's not a fucking joke. Police officers should be on the side of protecting the citizen and making sure that justice has a chance to be dealt. They don't need to be on the side of protecting their establishment. We don't need another us versus them dichotomy. We need a servant to the people, a mutual and beneficial relationship to those that we give the power to detain and use lethal force if need be. The conversation around police brutality has been derailed through the different lenses we have applied to the subject. Every time it comes up, the opposition finds a way to turn it into a conversation about something completely different. They successfully strawman every tactic. The entirety of the Kaepernick situation is proof of this. On September 11th of this year, that virtue signaling waste of a human being, Tommy Lauren, somehow turned a day of remembrance into a bashing of those who kneel. It's fucking disgusting. Police brutality exists. Corruption exists wherever there is power. We need to be vigilant in the pursuit of rooting this shit out. Justice is justice, and it doesn't care about your feels, right? Thanks for listening, and hopefully we can move past all this nonsense and have a real conversation about the actual issue. Until then, please like, subscribe, and share.